At 43 dang da, I thought I had finally mastered the delicate balance between protecting my younger sister Emma and protecting myself from her chaos. The scars from our childhood, watching our father struggle with his construction company while our mother battled depression, had taught us different survival strategies. I became the fixer, the one who absorbed everyone's problems and found solutions, while Emma learned to charm her way out of consequences. When our parents died in that horrific accident 6 years ago, leaving behind a $7.5 million, but I watched helplessly as she burned through it with investments that made no sense and a lifestyle that seemed designed to hemorrhage money. Every time I questioned her spending, she'd break down crying about how hard it was to live without our parents, and I'd find myself apologizing for being controlling instead of addressing the real problem. The first crack in my carefully maintained denial came 18 months ago, when Emma showed up at my Lake Forest office with a black eye she claimed came from a mugging in downtown Chicago. She was shaking, constantly checking her phone, and kept asking me for loans that we both knew would never be repaid. When I pressed her about the details of the attack, her story kept changing. First it happened near her apartment, then in a parking garage, then walking to her car from a restaurant. The inconsistencies should have been red flags, but Emma had always been a dramatic storyteller, and I wanted to believe her because the alternative was too terrible to consider. That night, I found myself Googling signs of gambling addiction and recognizing almost every symptom in my sister's recent behavior. The desperate need for money, the elaborate lies about where she'd been, the mood swings between manic excitement and crushing despair. But when I tried to have a gentle conversation about getting help, Emma exploded with such fury that I backed down immediately, telling myself I was being paranoid and judgmental. The woman who used to call me her big sister superhero screamed that I was trying to control her life just like our father had controlled our mother, and the comparison cut so deep that I apologized and wrote her another check. 3 months later, Emma came to me with what she called the opportunity of a lifetime, a real estate development project in Miami that required immediate capital injection and promised returns that would triple our investment within 2 years. She had professional-looking documents, detailed financial projections, and even arranged for me to meet her business partner, Vincent Caruso, a smooth-talking man who wore expensive suits and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd built fortunes from nothing. The project seemed legitimate, luxury condominiums in an emerging neighborhood, with pre-sales already securing 60% of the units and construction scheduled to begin within weeks. Emma was more animated than I'd seen her since our parents' funeral, talking about how this would be our chance to honor Dad's entrepreneurial legacy and build something lasting together. She showed me photos of the construction site, architectural renderings, and even letters of intent from high-profile buyers, all while emphasizing that we needed to move quickly before other investors claimed the remaining spots. Against every instinct and the explicit advice of my financial advisor, I agreed to invest $6 million, almost half of my liquid assets, because Emma convinced me this was our path to building the kind of generational wealth our parents had always dreamed of creating. The paperwork process felt rushed, but Emma assured me that real estate deals always moved quickly when serious money was involved. Vincent had established a special investment account that required both our signatures, which Emma explained was standard for family partnerships and would protect both our interests. I should have insisted on independent legal review, should have demanded to visit the construction site personally, should have verified every document through my own sources, but Emma's excitement was infectious, and I found myself caught up in her vision of our shared future. The signing took place in Vincent's downtown office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, and Emma held my hand as we committed to the investment that would supposedly transform our lives. As I transferred the money to the specified account, Emma squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Thank you for believing in us and Sarah. Mom and Dad would be so proud." Those words echoed in my mind for weeks afterward, a constant reminder that I was finally living up to the legacy our parents had left us. The wire transfer confirmation felt like the beginning of something beautiful, a new chapter where Emma and I would be partners, instead of the perpetual dynamic of protector and protected. 6 weeks later, I called the Miami development office to check on construction progress and arrange a site visit, only to discover that the phone number had been disconnected. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I tried the secondary contact numbers Vincent had provided, but every single one led to dead ends. Voicemail boxes that were full, numbers that had never been assigned, or businesses that had never heard of our project. I drove to Vincent's Chicago office, only to find an empty suite with no forwarding address and a security guard who told me the lease had been terminated the week after our signing. The architectural renderings, the buyer letters, the construction permits, every document Emma had shown me led to more dead ends when I tried to verify them independently. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial Emma's number. But when I finally reached her, she claimed to be traveling for business and couldn't talk. Her voice sounded different, distant and cold, and when I explained what I'd discovered, there was a long silence before she said, "Sarah, you're overreacting. Vincent is handling everything. I'll call you back when I have more information." But that call never came, and when I tried to reach her again the next day, her phone went straight to a voicemail box that was suddenly full. The drive to Emma's Lincoln Park apartment felt like traveling through a nightmare where reality kept shifting around me. I used the spare key she'd given me years earlier, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation for everything that was happening. But the apartment was completely empty. Not just cleared out, but stripped bare as if no one had ever lived there at all. The walls still had faint marks where her furniture had been, and I found myself touching those ghost impressions, trying to understand how my sister had vanished so completely from my life. On the kitchen counter, weighted down by an empty beer bottle, was a single sheet of paper with Emma's handwriting. "Sarah, I'm sorry it came to this, but I didn't have a choice. The people I owe money to don't negotiate, and they were going to hurt both of us if I didn't pay them. Please don't try to find me. I love you, but I can't fix this anymore." As I read those words, something fundamental broke inside me. Not just my heart, but my entire understanding of who Emma was and who I was in relation to her. The protective big sister who had spent 4 decades trying to save Emma from herself suddenly realized that the person I'd been protecting had never actually existed. I was alone in that empty apartment, holding a note from a stranger who had stolen my face and my money, and I understood with terrible clarity that the real Emma had been planning this betrayal for months, maybe years. The first week after Emma's disappearance passed in a haze of disbelief and desperate searching for rational explanations that didn't exist. I called every hospital in Chicago, filed a missing person report with police who seemed skeptical about the circumstances, and even hired a private investigator named David Chen, a former federal agent who specialized in financial fraud cases. David was brutally honest about my situation. Emma's disappearance was clearly voluntary. The investment scheme showed signs of sophisticated planning, and the chances of recovering my money were slim to none. But something in my desperation must have moved him, because he agreed to take the case at a reduced rate and promised to pursue every possible lead. Within 48 hours, David had uncovered evidence that made my blood run cold. Emma had been operating under multiple false identities for at least 3 years, renting apartments she never lived in, opening credit cards with fabricated employment histories, and leaving a trail of smaller financial victims across the Midwest. The woman I thought was struggling with poor decision-making had actually been running sophisticated cons, and I was just her biggest and most trusting mark. The deeper David dug into Emma's activities, the more horrifying the truth became. She hadn't been the victim of gambling debts. She had been a predator systematically targeting wealthy, emotionally vulnerable people through dating apps, grief support groups, and professional networking events. David found evidence of at least 12 other victims who had lost amounts ranging from $800,000 to Emma's various schemes. Each con had been tailored to the victim's specific vulnerabilities. She'd played the struggling single mother to divorced fathers, the grieving daughter to elderly widows, and the ambitious entrepreneur to successful businessmen looking for investment opportunities. The level of psychological manipulation was staggering. She'd researched her targets for weeks or months before making contact, learning their histories, their fears, and their dreams so she could position herself as exactly what they needed. The Emma who had cried on my shoulder about her loneliness and failures had been studying me the entire time, cataloging my weaknesses and preparing for the moment when she would exploit them all. But the most devastating discovery came when David found security footage from the Palmer House Hotel downtown, taken just 2 days after Emma's supposed disappearance. In the video, she was laughing and celebrating with Vincent and 2 other people I didn't recognize, toasting with champagne in the hotel's upscale bar. She looked radiant, more confident and alive than I'd ever seen her. And when she raised her glass for the toast, I could read her lips clearly enough to understand what she was saying. To Sarah, the best big sister a girl could ask for. The casual cruelty of using our relationship as a punchline hit me like a physical blow. But it was her genuine laughter that shattered something inside me permanently. This wasn't a desperate woman who'd made terrible choices under pressure. This was a predator who had enjoyed every moment of my destruction. The grief I'd been feeling wasn't just for the money. It was for the sister who had never existed, for the relationship I'd treasured that had been a performance, and for the woman I'd been before I learned what real betrayal felt like. 2 weeks into David's investigation, everything changed when he discovered that Emma was still in Chicago, hiding in plain sight under the name Elena Morrison at an extended-stay hotel in River North. She'd been conducting business as usual, meeting with new potential victims and planning additional cons while I'd been drowning in the wreckage of everything I'd believed about our relationship. The arrogance of staying in the same city where she'd destroyed me was breathtaking, but it also presented an opportunity for surveillance that wouldn't have existed if she'd actually fled. David began documenting her activities, photographing her meetings with Vincent and their associates, and slowly building a profile of their criminal network. What he found was even more extensive than we'd imagined. They were operating like a small corporation, with different members specializing in identity creation, money laundering, victim research, and emotional manipulation. Emma's role was as a closer, someone who could gain Mark's trust completely, and convince them to part with life-changing amounts of money. During this period, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the woman I'd been 2 months earlier. I began secretly recording every phone call and meeting with anyone connected to Emma's disappearance. I'd started doing this initially to help David's investigation, but as I listened back to the recordings, I began to notice patterns in my own behavior that horrified me. Even after discovering the fraud, even after finding the empty apartment and the cruel note, part of me was still making excuses for Emma, still hoping there was some explanation that would restore the sister I'd loved. The recordings forced me to confront the depth of my own denial and the extent to which I'd been complicit in my own victimization. When David played back conversations where I'd admitted to knowing something was wrong, but choosing to ignore my instincts, I realized that Emma hadn't just stolen my money, she'd stolen my ability to trust myself. And that loss was almost more devastating than the financial fraud. The breaking point came when David showed me surveillance footage of Emma meeting with her next intended victim, Patricia Hendricks, a 60-year-old widow whose husband had died in a construction accident 3 months earlier, leaving her with a $20 million settlement and no experience managing large sums of money. Emma had connected with Patricia through a grief support group at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, positioning herself as someone who understood the unique pain of losing family unexpectedly. Watching Emma work her manipulation on this grieving woman, using the same tactics she'd perfected on me, telling the same lies about honoring our parents' memory, ignited something in me that was beyond anger. Patricia reminded me of our mother in her final years, vulnerable and trusting, and the thought of Emma destroying another family the way she'd destroyed mine was unbearable. That night, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the person I'd been before Emma's betrayal. I was going to stop her, whatever it took. The protective big sister was dead, but in her place stood someone far more dangerous, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The transformation from victim to hunter didn't happen overnight, but once I committed to stopping Emma, I felt a clarity of purpose that I'd never experienced before. I liquidated my remaining investments, sold my Lake Forest house, and moved into a modest downtown apartment that was closer to David's office and gave me better access to Emma's known locations. Every decision I made was calculated around a single objective: gathering enough evidence to ensure Emma and her network faced serious federal charges while preventing them from destroying Patricia Hendricks or anyone else. The woman who had once agonized over every choice, who had second-guessed herself into paralysis, was gone. In her place was someone who could make hard decisions quickly and live with the consequences, because I'd already survived the worst betrayal imaginable. Emma had taught me that trust was a luxury I could no longer afford, but she'd also freed me from the burden of trying to see the good in people who had proven they possessed none. Working with David, I developed a comprehensive surveillance operation that would have impressed the FBI agents who later took over the case. We tracked Emma's movements, identified the other members of her criminal network, and began documenting their methods for targeting and manipulating victims. What we discovered was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple fraud. They were running psychological warfare on vulnerable people, destroying lives with the same casual efficiency that legitimate businesses use to sell products. Emma's specialty was long-term relationship cons, where she would spend months or even years building trust with her victims before striking. She was particularly effective at targeting people with unresolved grief or trauma, positioning herself as someone who understood their pain while secretly studying their vulnerabilities. The depth of her psychological manipulation was staggering, but it also provided me with crucial insight into how her mind worked and how she might be stopped. The breakthrough came when I decided to become bait myself, using a carefully constructed false identity to infiltrate Emma's network from the inside. David helped me create Michelle Sanders, a recently divorced woman with a substantial settlement who was looking for investment opportunities and struggling with depression after her marriage ended. I dyed my hair blonde, changed my style completely, and practiced a different accent until I could maintain it effortlessly. The irony of using Emma's own tactics against her wasn't lost on me, but I felt no guilt about the deception. They had forfeited any right to honesty when they chose to make their living by destroying innocent people's lives. Within 2 weeks, I had successfully approached Vincent at a bar where the group frequently scouted for new victims, and he was immediately interested in Michelle's story and her supposed financial assets. Over the course of 6 weeks, I gathered intelligence that would eventually bring down the entire network. Vincent and his associates bragged openly about their past successes, including what they called the family job, Emma's con against me, describing in detail how she had manipulated my emotions and exploited my guilt about our parents' death. Listening to them laugh about my pathetic devotion to Emma was torture. But it also provided exactly the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors would need to prove premeditation and conspiracy. I recorded every conversation, photographed every document, and slowly built a comprehensive picture of their operation that revealed connections to similar criminal networks in at least 6 other states. But the most valuable intelligence came when Vincent, drunk on his own arrogance, revealed their timeline for the Patricia Hendricks con and their plans to expand into targeting veterans, families, and elderly people in assisted living facilities. The plan I developed was risky but necessary. I would reveal myself to Patricia, explain the danger she was in, and convince her to cooperate with a federal investigation that I was preparing to initiate. It meant exposing my own investigation and potentially alerting Emma to my presence in Chicago. But I couldn't stand by and watch another innocent person fall victim to my sister's predation. When I finally approached Patricia at the grief support group where Emma had first made contact with her, I was prepared for skepticism, disbelief, or even anger. But Patricia's response surprised me completely. After I explained who I was and what Emma had done to me, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "I knew something was wrong. I've been alive for 60 years, and I've never met anyone who tried so hard to be exactly what I needed them to be." Her willingness to help wasn't born from naivety, but from a sharp intelligence that Emma had underestimated. And together we began planning an operation that would give Emma exactly what she deserved. But as we prepared to set the trap that would end Emma's criminal career, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about my sister's motivations. Hidden in the surveillance footage David had gathered was evidence that Emma hadn't been lying about everything. She really did owe money to dangerous people, and they really had threatened both our lives if she didn't pay them. The realization that she might have started down this path to protect me, even if she'd lost herself completely along the way, didn't excuse what she'd done, but it added a layer of complexity to my feelings that I wasn't prepared for. Emma was still a predator who had destroyed innocent people's lives, and she still had to be stopped. But the black and white certainty that had been driving my quest for justice suddenly became muddied with shades of gray that threatened to undermine my resolve. As I stared at that footage, showing Emma crying alone in her hotel room after a phone call from someone who was clearly threatening her, I had to make a choice about whether I was seeking justice or revenge, and whether there was any difference between the two when the person you were hunting was your own sister. Patricia Hendricks proved to be an invaluable ally, bringing not only her cooperation, but a sharp intelligence that had been shaped by decades of running her late husband's construction company alongside him. When I explained the full scope of Emma's criminal network and the danger she was in, Patricia's reaction was swift and decisive. If your sister thinks she can play games with a grieving widow, she's about to learn what real consequences look like. Together, we developed a plan that would allow federal authorities to gather irrefutable evidence while protecting Patricia from financial harm. The key was making Emma believe she was executing the perfect con while actually walking into a trap that had been months in the making. Patricia would continue her friendship with Emma, but now every conversation would be recorded, every document would be photographed, and every lie would be carefully documented by FBI agents who had finally agreed to take the case seriously after David presented them with our evidence. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone expected, primarily because Emma's network had been operating across state lines and using sophisticated money laundering techniques that elevated their crimes to the level of organized racketeering. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who led the task force, was particularly interested in the psychological manipulation aspects of the cons, calling Emma's methods some of the most sophisticated emotional abuse tactics she'd seen in 20 years of investigating white-collar crime. But what really caught the FBI's attention was the discovery that Emma's network had connections to a larger criminal organization that specialized in elder abuse and veterans' fraud, crimes that carried severe federal penalties and had become a priority for the Justice Department. My sister hadn't just been running small-time cons. She'd been part of a criminal enterprise that was systematically targeting America's most vulnerable populations for financial exploitation. The operation to capture Emma and her associates required Patricia to perform the role of her life, convincing Emma that she was falling for the same manipulation tactics that had worked on me and countless others. We set up a fake construction investment opportunity that Patricia claimed to be considering, complete with forged documents and a fabricated timeline that would pressure Emma into moving quickly. Watching Patricia work was like studying a masterclass in counter-manipulation. She knew exactly which emotional buttons Emma was trying to push, and how to respond in ways that would build Emma's confidence while secretly recording evidence of her crimes. The most chilling part was listening to Emma discuss me during these recorded conversations, describing me as pathetically easy to manipulate, and bragging about how she'd been planning my downfall since our parents' funeral. She even admitted that she'd been stealing smaller amounts from me for years, using my guilt about surviving the car accident that killed our parents as leverage to make me more generous with money. But the investigation took an unexpected turn when Agent Martinez discovered that Emma's gambling debts were real and that she owed money to a loan shark named Tony Marconi, who had connections to organized crime families in Chicago and Detroit. The threats Emma had received weren't empty intimidation tactics. Marconi had a reputation for violence, and several of his previous debtors had disappeared or suffered serious injuries when they failed to pay. This revelation didn't excuse Emma's crimes, but it provided crucial context for understanding how a troubled, but not necessarily evil person could become a predator capable of destroying the people who loved her most. The pressure from Marconi had created a desperate situation where Emma felt she had to choose between becoming a criminal or risking both our lives. And she'd chosen the path that felt like survival, even though it led to the destruction of everyone around her. 3 weeks into the federal operation, Emma made her final mistake. She tried to pressure Patricia into wiring $8 million to an account in the Cayman Islands, claiming that immediate action was necessary to secure their position in the investment opportunity. But instead of transferring real funds, Patricia sent a wire that had been coordinated with federal authorities, money that would lead directly to Emma's arrest and the exposure of the entire money laundering operation. The moment the transfer was confirmed, FBI agents moved simultaneously at 4 locations: the hotel where Emma was staying, Vincent's new office in the Loop, the warehouse where they'd been converting stolen money into cryptocurrency, and Tony Marconi's restaurant where Emma had been making payments on her debts. I watched from a surveillance van as Emma was led away in handcuffs, her face showing genuine shock and fear for the first time since I'd known her. She kept looking around as if expecting someone to rescue her, but the network of criminals she'd trusted had all been arrested within minutes of each other. The moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating came when Emma was brought to the federal building for interrogation. Through a one-way mirror, I watched as she was informed that her own sister had been instrumental in her capture, and the look on her face when she realized I'd been hunting her for months was a mixture of respect, betrayal, and something that might have been pride. She asked to speak with me, and against Agent Martinez's advice, I agreed to the meeting because I needed to look her in the eye one final time and ask the question that had been haunting me for months. When did you stop being my sister and become my enemy? Emma's answer was delivered with the same charming smile she'd used to manipulate me for 43 years. Sarah, I was never your sister. I was always just someone who happened to share your parents. But you were so desperate to have a family that you created a person who didn't exist, and I decided to play the role until it was time to cash out. Those words finally freed me from any remaining guilt about what I'd done, because they confirmed that the Emma I'd loved had indeed been a fiction. And the woman sitting across from me was exactly what she'd always been, a stranger who had stolen my face and my name and my trust, and who deserved everything that was about to happen to her. 18 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Emma receive a sentence of 25 years in prison for racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that had been enhanced due to her role in targeting elderly and disabled victims. The judge called her crimes a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds, and noted that the psychological damage she'd inflicted on her victims was, in many cases, more devastating than the financial losses. Emma showed no remorse during the sentencing, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence and even claiming that she was the real victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by jealous family members and overzealous federal agents. Her delusion was complete. She genuinely believed that she was being persecuted for being smarter and more ambitious than everyone around her, and that her victims deserved what happened to them for being weak and gullible. As she was led away in prison chains, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Naked hatred, mixed with something that might have been respect for the opponent who had finally outmaneuvered her. The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations, but it came at a cost that went far beyond money. Federal agents had frozen Emma's accounts and seized assets from the entire criminal network, ultimately recovering $4.8 million of my stolen money, plus additional assets that would be distributed among the other victims. The investigation had also led to the arrests of 12 other people involved in similar scams across the Midwest, effectively dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 5 years. But the process of testifying against Emma, reliving the betrayal in court, and confronting the other victims whose lives she'd destroyed had taken a psychological toll that I hadn't anticipated. I spent months in therapy, learning how to trust my own instincts again and working through the complex grief of losing someone who had never really existed. The woman who had been desperate to save Emma was gone forever, but the person who emerged from that loss was stronger and more authentic than anyone I'd ever been before. The most unexpected consequence of Emma's arrest was the relationship I developed with Patricia Hendricks, who became not just a close friend, but a business partner in creating something meaningful from our shared trauma. We established a nonprofit organization called Truth Shield that specialized in helping victims of family financial fraud and providing education about the warning signs of emotional manipulation by people in positions of trust. The organization grew rapidly, funded by donations from people who had experienced similar betrayals and supported by federal agencies who recognized the need for better resources in this area. Every person we helped felt like a small victory against the Emmas of the world, proof that victims could become advocates and that pain could be transformed into protection for others. Working with Patricia taught me that healing didn't require forgiveness. It required purpose, and finding a way to ensure that my suffering had meaning beyond my own recovery. But the most profound change came in my relationship with the concept of family itself. Emma's betrayal had shattered my belief that blood relationships were inherently sacred, but it had also freed me to create chosen family bonds that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than biological obligation. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during years of focusing on Emma's problems, developed romantic relationships built on honesty rather than rescue fantasies, and learned to value people who showed up consistently rather than those who generated the most drama. The family I built in the aftermath of Emma's destruction was smaller, but infinitely more reliable than anything I'd had before. And I realized that my parents would have been proud of the woman I'd become. Not because I'd protected Emma, but because I'd finally learned to protect myself and others from people who couldn't be saved. 2 years after Emma's sentencing, I received a letter from her in federal prison, the first communication we'd had since her arrest. She claimed to have found religion and wanted to apologize for what she'd done, asking for my forgiveness and suggesting that we could rebuild our relationship when she was eventually released. But as I read her words, I could see the same manipulation techniques she'd always used, just dressed up in the language of spiritual awakening. The Emma who had written that letter was the same person who had stolen my money and laughed about my gullibility. She'd simply found a new performance to try on me, hoping that religious conversion might be more effective than tears and threats. I threw the letter away without responding, because the woman who would have agonized over that decision no longer existed. Emma had given me the greatest gift possible by showing me exactly who she was, and I'd used that knowledge to build a life that was stronger, more purposeful, and infinitely more authentic than anything I'd had when I was trying to save someone who had never wanted to be saved. 5 years later, when reporters asked me about my feelings toward Emma during the documentary they were making about our case, I surprised myself with the honesty of my answer. I don't hate her anymore, because hate requires caring about someone's well-being, and I simply don't. Emma taught me that some people are born without the capacity for genuine human connection, and that trying to love them is like trying to fill a bucket with no bottom. The best thing she ever did for me was showing me who she really was, because it forced me to figure out who I really was underneath all the people-pleasing and guilt and desperate need to be needed. The sister I mourned never existed, but the woman I became because of that mourning is someone I'm proud to be. Emma had stolen my money and my trust and my illusions about family. But in return, she'd given me something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that I could survive anything, rebuild from nothing, and create meaning from even the most devastating betrayal. She'd intended to destroy me, but instead she'd set me free. Sometimes the greatest betrayals become the most powerful catalysts for transformation. Sarah discovered that family isn't defined by blood, but by loyalty, honesty, and the courage to protect yourself from those who would destroy you. In losing her sister, she found herself, and in seeking justice, she discovered her true purpose. The $6 million Emma stole was just money, but the strength, wisdom, and authentic relationships Sarah built in its place were priceless. The most profound revenge wasn't Emma's imprisonment. It was Sarah's freedom to become who she was always meant to be. So, what did you think of Sarah and Emma's story? That twist at the end was chilling, wasn't it? Leave a comment below telling me what you would do in Sarah's place. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Just click the red button below. Speaking of which, you can't miss the next video that's already appearing on your screen. Click on the video that's appearing and I'll see you there.